All right. Let's talk about Risk. Not the board game, the other thing. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You and your group are trying to sneak up on, a group of, let's say, bandits out in the woods. And as you get closer, the DM says, hey, you're close enough now. Everybody is going to have to make a stealth check if you want to keep sneaking forward. And everybody groans because you know the outcome. There are going to be a couple people that you for sure know are going to pass. That's the rogue and other high dex characters. And then there are a few people who are 100% going to fail because they're wearing heavy armor, they have disadvantage, they have a low dex, whatever it is. And because everyone in the group is having to make that roll together, and it's stealth, so if one person fails and draws attention, most other people end up having to drop out of stealth in order to help the person who got caught, because this is this binary pass-fail where you either totally get what you want or you totally fail. And most DMs, in my experience, don't really have the training or familiarity with other gradients of success or gradients of failure. And they just say, oh, you failed? Well, you get spotted, without any kind of like guidelines or anything else like that. And so it is essentially like a quadruple disadvantage roll where you will get caught. And that always bugged me. And in trying to solve that design problem, I ended up creating the sort of core resource economy of my game and a central pillar and sort of theme of the entire thing as well that has persisted to this day. So this is the sort of devlog about, let's call it Risk, because that's essentially right. As a side note, when I say devlog, this is the sort of developer diary of developing our game. I'm not saying that anyone needs to do it this way or not do it this way. I'm not really advocating. I'm just sort of explaining our journey so that you can kind of have a sense of the decisions we made and why. These are all subject to change. The game is still in active development, but here's what we have now and how we got there. We can cut the music, but I like the sound effects. I'm going to keep those. Anyway, so stealth being like quadruple disadvantage bothered me. And I think it was sort of multiple issues kind of conflating all together. But the one big one was not having this like gradient of success or like ability to sort of fail forward, essentially, without having some kind of major setback on a single failed check. To me, good stealth design is treated like puzzle gameplay. And this is the rules. You'll hear me say this 1,000 times. This is the result of having done research. I didn't just like come up with this idea. It's like, but stealth treated like puzzle gameplay in the sense that you need a clear objective and you need to know that when you try something, that when it succeeds, that it succeeds cleanly. When it fails, that it fails with a way for you to keep going and adjust or do something to try and, try again or try in a different way. And when it kind of has this like middle version of either success with a cost or success with a consequence or a twist or whatever, that you can kind of see those odds transparently and make decisions accordingly. And then you get the feedback of what you're trying versus what's happening in the fiction with enough time to react to it and keep going. And as I was sort of investigating this like stealth thing that was very specific, I sort of stumbled across like what happens when you try to build like that carried tension of like not just a single role that matters, but many roles. And so you're sort of walking a line across like, oh, we're trying to get from here to there. And maybe it's multiple scenes in a row. And so do you want to track essentially that tension across all of those scenes? And how do you do that? And I'm doing my research and trying to figure out a way that would work for our game. So what's the structure of that? This takes me back. The first thing we tried, I had called risk chains. And a risk chain was multiple moments, beats, or even multiple scenes in a row if they were immediately and directly related, where you are tracking how much risk the party is incurring and basically how well they're doing across a single sequence or like one goal, essentially. Like we need to get from here to there, and everything that happens on the way to there, that is a risk chain. A lot of this stuff is inspired by Blades in the Dark, Ironsworn Starforged, Fate, games like that. So the purpose here is to give non-combat sequences and scenes like a structure, something that you could actually hang mechanics on, but also communicate to the players, here's where you are in the context of everything that's going on, so that they understand, oh, we are in this level of danger right now. Because while, again, a GM can just say that, oftentimes that isn't really that well communicated, or they think that that's like metagaming, like telling players, oh, you have a sense of how much danger. I wanted a way to tell players how much risk that they felt they could safely take on before they were really starting to push it. And then if you really need to push it, then you can, but you know that going in, essentially. So you're not sort of, the rug's not pulled out from under you when you try something and then fail, and then it's like a dire consequence. So this is basically ripping off Blades in the Dark, but here we go. Having like a payoff clock, a die that, would tick down. It's a clock, but it's counting down. The GM has like a payoff in mind for whatever's related narratively to the goal that the players are trying to accomplish. And then moving through the risk chain towards that, major story beats or major rolls that are made, whether progress occurs or a setback occurs, that die ticks down and down and down until eventually it gets to 0. I had stuff that it was like, you could have a hookup that would come from an investigation that you would do earlier. Like, this is a lot of like laying groundwork to see if it like rang true in my system. And then, as you'll see, we never even tested this. This ended up being a structure that didn't work, but I'll explain it anyway. The main thing here was that there was a struggle meter. And on one side, you had risk, and on the other side, you had reward. Just two kind of opposites for the player's point of view. And it would basically be if a player or a group roll happened that was failed, it would push that meter towards risk. Things are getting riskier. But if you succeeded something, it would push it back towards reward. And then the GM would flavor and push the narrative beats of the scene in one of those two directions based on where in that track you happen to be. So the more that it was, leaning into risk, the worse those kind of consequences for a roll would get. So if you fail your stealth roll right in the middle, that's just 1 point into risk. It's like, okay, like the guard heard something, but he kind of dismissed it. And so you're okay, but there may be a higher alert. Checks will be harder from now on. That kind of thing. And then, of course, if going to the reward side, things get a little bit easier, but maybe you get, you have higher luck when trying to like search for items or other kinds of stuff. You could flavor it however you wanted. That was the goal. And really the point was just that failing a single roll does not inherently mean total disaster. And because you had this transparent sort of meter, you would be able to then communicate to the players what was happening in a way that everyone immediately understood. So if the payoff die ever hit 0, just to kind of wrap that thought up, whatever the sort of thematic payoff was in mind would be also themed based on where you were in the struggle meter. So if the payoff at the very end is like a narrative beat of like, you find the character that you're looking for, well, maybe you on the reward side, maybe you find them and there's no guards around, and actually she wasn't even like tied up. She had started to escape all on her own. Great, you can get the hell out. And on the flip side, it would be something the opposite. There would be some kind of worse situation to have to deal with. There was some other stuff bolted on, but ultimately it was just kind of cumbersome and over-engineered and really just a rip-off of a bunch of other game mechanics with no real like imagination. It was sort of playing in that space to see how we felt about it, and ultimately it didn't really feel right. So we iterated. So the next one I ended up calling the Escalation Engine. This was based on the idea that you would keep a track, a meter of some type, but instead of like, walking it across like the DM screen or whatever, you would actually track it in pools of dice, because our game is a dice pool game, starting to like put the identity of the game into the mechanics a little bit. In one pool, player facing, everybody can see it, you would be tracking risk again. So same kind of idea, failed rolls, add a tracker to that pool. I always had the idea of like, make it D12s, because D12 was kind of like the king die in our game. It was the underdog die at the time, not anymore. So it was D12s. Put a D12 in the pool, and once the risk gets to a certain threshold that the DM has in mind, somewhere from 2 to 5, like a very small amount, then that would trigger what we were calling an escalation, which is a narrative beat that changes the scene for the worse. for the player characters. Something fairly substantial happens that changes everything that they now have to deal with. And then all of those D12s in the risk would get picked up and put into a pool of what we were calling Defiance. And this is the invention of Defiance. This is actually something that still persists into the game. Granted, it works differently than it did then. But that was a pool of resources that the players could use to juice their rolls. So whenever you had the bad enough luck to get to a point of an escalation, things get worse, you then had a bunch of resources based on your character saying, no, we're going to fight back and be defiant and play extra hard. On the GM side, behind the screen, we had the GM tracking experience. So every time a player succeeded on a roll, an important roll, not every roll, the GM would mark an amount of experience based on how important that roll happened to be. It would be anywhere from 1 to 5, let's say. And then when an escalation occurs, the players get all of their defiance, risk resets to 0. Behind the screen, the GM would take the amount of experience that had come through and turn that into a resource that I was calling revenge. And that would be the counter to Defiance. It would be basically fighting back and forth, very much inspired by Draw Steel, but I think also, very similar to Hope and Fear. That was very much in the air at the time. And so I was kind of wanting to play in that space. This, again, was not something that ever even made it to playtesting. It was just theory crafting that I was looking for something that would create a stronger sense of identity for the game. And I took it a little too far. And Matt pushed back. He doesn't like experience points really at all as a sort of requirement to playing a game. I thought it could have worked in a cool way. I'm still kind of interested in how that would work, but I do agree that it's overbuilt and doesn't need all these moving parts. It was restrictive. So we simplified some more. And here we get to Escalation Engine 2.0. And this we did actually test. Similar idea. Cut the fat. So no XP tracking, no turning XP into revenge, none of that conversion, none of that. Instead, you still track risk from 1 to 5, and as players still fail rolls. And what triggers risk is when a player fails a roll of consequence, something that actually matters to the narrative, whatever it is, that would be a roll that you would fail. We were calling it a risky roll, which didn't really roll off the tongue very well. Stay tuned for later, because we ended up changing it. And the point was, the GM would tell the players that this roll is risky before they attempted it, just so they understood, oh, this is what's at stake. They can see where they are in that track, and they know what they're about to do will affect it if they fail. That risk ticks up and up and up. And once it hits a threshold that I think at the time it was still the threshold that the GM had in mind, although I ended up changing it to just be 5, and then the GM would basically start the threshold partway through if they wanted a very short track, a high-risk scene where there were fewer steps to get to that escalation. You could start it at 3 instead of 0 or 1 or whatever. And then by the end, once you hit 5, that all converts into a pool of defiance for the players that any of them can use, as before, and a pool of revenge for the GM. And that made the revenge currency transparent. The players could actually see it. They knew the GM's getting the same amount that we are. And you kind of get your gradients of success vibe out of that. The players know where they stand in terms of oh, this scene has gone terribly or not. And we can sort of try maybe riskier things when it's lower, and maybe we play a little more carefully when it's higher. And I liked that concept in theory, but what actually happens at the table is that when that risk track is low, 2 assumptions are made. 1, players assume that because you're very far away from an escalation, which is things go bad for you, we can do anything. We've got many steps before that will ever happen. People who were GMs playing the game and playtesting also thought, if I were running this and I had, some kind of consequence or narrative beat in mind for this scene that I wanted to happen at a certain point, I wouldn't be allowed to. The game mechanics would prevent me from doing that until risk hit 5. And that actually wasn't how it was designed. We had it where If the GM has something in mind that they want to make happen, if it's narratively relevant, it can just happen. They can just do that. That's the power of the GM. But that fights directly with the mechanics. It was saying two completely different things, and it was confusing. And it was also, again, kind of a heavy structure to work within. Like, I ran that quite a number of times, and I found it cumbersome. And for a while, I was like, well, maybe I'm just not used to running in this structure, and I just kind of have to get used to it. But then after a period of time, and after doing it enough times with the same exact adventure, because it's a playtest, you just sort of realize, like, if I can't pick this up and I designed it, who is? Like, it was too clunky. We did start to dabble with the idea of degrees of failure in terms of, if you fail only by so much, then it only adds 1 to risk. But maybe if you fail really hard, it adds 2. So it could jump a little bit. And then maybe the GM could spend some of their leftover revenge to just immediately raise the risk on their own. Like, we were playing with that flexibility. The problem is always coming back to narratively, sometimes you just want this stuff to happen. You just want it to flow, but you're constantly checking in with this like overarching mechanical structure first. Another key issue is that the whole like escalation thing, it was always meant to be a narrative escalation, but then that didn't really feel like, first of all, it forces the GM to come up with something when they may not have anything for that encounter. And that's sort of not great. And it also forces a kind of pacing. Like, yes, you can kind of play with the pacing and manipulate a little bit, but it's counterintuitive. You're not referencing your own storytelling pacing. You're referencing the track and trying to figure out how to manipulate it. It's slow. When an escalation would happen, I always tripped on, do I narrate the actual fiction of the escalation first and then go back and tell the players like what mechanical effect is going to affect them? Because we had a list, like a preset list of like, here are the things that will actually happen in the scene. And it would be like features that cost this resource to use, like your stamina resource, are a little bit more expensive. Or, in this scene, everything has gone loud, and so you can't be stealthy anymore. For the rest of this sequence, stealth is not an option. It was stuff like that, just like blanket effects to change the scene. And I like that in principle, but in play, it was really clunky, and it also just put a lot of pressure on the GM to like have to come up with these things. So I will say some playtesters did enjoy it, but I think it was more from the side of novelty, like coming out of D&D where there's nothing like this and trying something new and feeling like, it does kind of make me feel like I have a sense of where tonally in the scene we are and like how much tension and risk and whatever. Like, I think there was a basic element of it working, but then all of the other issues that I mentioned also were applying. It just wasn't fun. One of the key pieces of feedback was from a playtester who said, why not just give the two resources you're talking about to, either the GM or the player based on the actual role that's occurring? Don't worry, like take the risk thing out of it. You don't need it. Because then as the GM is getting revenge, track that openly, and those players will see that starting to pile up, much like fear with Daggerheart. And then that will carry the kind of tension that you want them to feel and experience. And yeah, it won't be quite as like hard-coded as like risk increasing, but it will still be like this thing that the GM can use against you if if you're failing these rolls. And then if they succeed the rolls, give them Defiance. That made some sense in terms of being simpler, but the whole Defiance thing was like something bad happens to you, you get Defiance as a result. It, take damage or, fail a roll that you wanted to succeed. But then there were weird things where like, if you succeed the roll and get Defiance, that makes sense from just the game design standpoint of reward the player for doing the thing you want them to try to do, succeed. If you're rewarding them with this crucial resource only for failing, then they're going to start trying to fail. It's counterintuitive. And then revenge feels like it has to go on the opposite end of it. But the GM getting revenge for you succeeding your role, it was messy. I wasn't convinced. And so I was still kind of like clinging on to this thing. So we had one final iteration. And I called this control and chaos. And the design was still have the track. It's not the risk track anymore. It is starting at 0, you have control for the players particularly, and because it's always from their perspective. And that just means things are kind of normal. However, when you fail those important rolls, that moves the track up 1 to a 1 specifically. And it's moving towards chaos. So +1, +2, and then +3 at the very top. And so we also had a way for players to lower that track back down again. So instead of hitting a threshold and resetting, it was just going up and down based on the rolls, kind of similar to the very first idea with the struggle meter, which I still think is a funny name. And so the idea here was I was trying to figure out a way to hard code the roll result of success with setback, because I liked that mechanic and I hadn't figured out a way to do it in other areas of the game. And I was still trying to use this meter. And so my idea was like, once you get to +1, +2, or +3, the target number that you have to beat to get a perfect result is increased by that amount. But the original target number that the GM sets for your roll, which would be, lower than that, if you can beat that, you at the very least get your mixed success, your success with the setback. And so now, the worse things go, you have this ability to give players narratively diverse roll results, because I never liked that kind of binary pass-fail, and I had been looking for a way to incorporate something like this. However, again, still not perfect. As you've probably noticed, this creates a very crunchy kind of system where you're constantly referencing that track to check your roll results, not only against the target number that the GM told you when you made your roll, but also against this other thing, but also it's only applying during risky rolls and not those other sort of normal, like non-threatening rolls. It's just these and it's not really math heavy, it's just like numbers heavy, like having multiple different numbers to check against. I'm sure it would have been okay, but we ran this like twice and I realized, I was wrong. It just didn't work. I had insisted on using this, chaos and control track because I was sad that we were sort of moving away from it. And I wanted that like gradient of success feeling. That's why I built it. But I also had this sense of like not wanting, a single roll to result in total catastrophe. And those are like two distinct concepts that I was kind of conflating together. What I ended up actually wanting at the table was what we have now today, which we've had for about 5 months since we landed on this finally. I took the advice of that one playtester and just killed my darling. It's a callback, I know. Look, I didn't say I was perfect at this. Like, this is the design lesson that I learn over and over and over again. When I get super invested in one thing, I want to make sure to try it out, but I am also immediately suspicious of how invested I am in it. And I start checking with other people how it actually feels. And the whole point of Kill Your Darlings, just as a side note, it's not like if you like something, get rid of it. That's not what Kill Your Darlings means. Or murder your darlings, as the original quote supposedly goes. It means if there is something that you are deeply attached to, that attachment can blind you from the fact that it is damaging the final product. That's what it means. And you need to be able to see past that to what the actual impact is in your, whatever it is, a book or a movie or a game. You have to see that impact and see it for what it actually is. And then you can decide for real. And oftentimes that means killing your darling. So what did we actually land on? First thing, this whole risky rolls thing, I said this in a previous video, but we renamed it to daunting. We didn't want it to make it sound like every roll that wasn't risky was actually not risky narratively. Anything that has any interesting narrative consequences attached to it, that is daunting. Anything at all. And then a very small number of other kinds of rolls end up being normal rolls that are just binary pass-fail. It's like, can you remember some piece of lore? Or are you're haggling with a merchant with no other real stakes involved, like things like that, just pass fail, whatever. Or it's daunting. You're affecting the world in some way. You're changing the scene to try and benefit yourself and your party and make real progress through the story. So when you make a daunting check, we call it now, it's like an ability check in D&D. Same thing. You open up a window for that middle result, a success with setback. You roll a pool of dice against a target number, and if you get one success, you get that middle result. We call it a dirty success. If you get 2 or more successes, that is a shiny success. Get everything you want, no consequences, the story proceeds. And then, of course, if you don't beat that at all, you get a failure. There's an actual consequence that occurs, and now you have to deal with that. And we went back and forth on where Defiance and, we changed Revenge to be Doom, Defiance and Doom, where those play into this, where it generates. Long story short, now what we have, and I think this is what we'll stick with, the player who rolled gets 1 Defiance at the end of the roll, and the Ether Guide, that's our term for the GM, gets 1 Doom every time, no matter what. It's just representing this was a major potential divergence in the plot. You are changing the world, and therefore you are representing that change in a metacurrency, in something where the world can react to you, or you can react right back. And it just sort of amplifies things. It just ratchets up the, not necessarily tension, but just like the narrative stakes, like knowing that more things are possible now, and we can influence the world in bigger ways just because we are attempting this thing, no matter which way it goes. And this is great because, frankly, it leans into the exact point of our game design up to that point, which was the dice pools. Like, it's not dealing with all of this other like scaffolding that you have to like climb around on just to like run the game. We already had dice pools in the game. We already had the built-in, how many successes can you roll? Like, that is a classic dice pool mechanic. So just use that. It's so simple. And yes, I do think there is a little bit of like, I don't know, narrative communication with the player that gets lost if you don't have something that's sort of telling them like, oh, this risky, or, that safe, whatever. But I also saw that be a double-edged sword, where if things were safe, players would, they push it a little bit in a way that maybe didn't even match their character just because they knew they could. And so that felt a little too metagamey. It felt a little too transparent. And I think that was the ultimate lesson, was I was trying to go for a very transparent system so that the players could really act in a way that they knew would have the results they would expect, good or bad. Like, you fail that group stealth check, but you're not all the way over on that bad side of the spectrum, and therefore, yeah, you might be okay. We took it too far. This is the happy medium. This is so much faster. It's so much easier to run. It's so much more intuitive. It just flows instead of trickling. So what happened to the whole escalation thing? That got cut with the meter, right? And those effects essentially got converted into a small list of things that the GM could spend Doom on. And they became a lot more kind of personal. And we started trying to tie them more to narrative beats that were sort of broad enough that we knew they would happen and could be applied in a lot of different kinds of scenes, but specific enough that they would be useful. The trick with that was really, and we're still kind of working this out, if you tie debuffs to a metacurrency that the GM has to spend in order to apply them, you're implicitly telling everybody, players and GM, that they cannot do that thing unless they spend the metacurrency. So, in D&D, it's a very common thing to say, oh, you're trying to, leap across the chasm, but I don't know, like you're in this like plate armor. I think I'm going to give you a disadvantage on that roll for whatever like narrative thing that's happening. That's like not a rule per se, but it should be within the GM's right to impose that, or to give them advantage for something that they thought, was really clever and wanted to reward. Like, you can do that. And we wanted to leave that flexibility with our GMs as well. And so those effects really have to be very specific, kind of like harsh rule breaking things that require a currency in order to be done. But then because the players know that those things are possible, as long as there's Doom on the table, they then start to feel that sense of tension around it. Like, oh, maybe we should be a little more careful, or like basically just tread carefully, or spend our own, defiance on our rolls just to make sure that we can kind of, it's like an arms race, and that's kind of fun. Anyway, I think I have rambled on quite long enough. So if you enjoyed it, go ahead and subscribe. Keep up with our journey. We're releasing game design videos like this all the time and have big plans for the future. And until then, I will see you in the next video.